according to our Messiah, we need to worship in spirit and truth, not in spirit and what is false, because that is what the Father is seeking, and that is what He wants. So, is that what we want? Truth? To worship in truth? We then must ask, are sun god traditions true or false ways? If we really want a relationship with our Creator, if we really care about the way He feels, if we really care about how much He loves us, then we propose, let's care about Him. Let's serve Him and worship Him in truth, and only truth. This is where we begin to test everything. This is also where it might start becoming uncomfortable. So many of us have grown up in a system and a culture that declares Christmas and Easter to be completely normal, especially in the Christian faith. But as Paul rightfully said, test everything. Only hold on to what is good. Then let's test everything and determine if Christmas and Easter are good. So those are the two main things we need to test about Christmas and Easter. How God said He does not like to be worshipped, and how God said He likes to be worshipped. Meaning this, number one, we need to determine if Christmas and Easter are rooted in sun god holidays and traditions. If they are, Yahweh, who never changes, says He detests such things, and He pleads with us multiple times for us to not worship Him in such ways. Number two, we also need to determine if Christmas and Easter are rooted in things that are not truth, but instead what is false, because we are told that the Father desires us to only worship in spirit and truth, and we need to respect that. We are not setting out to discover what Christmas and Easter often means to us, or even means to you, but instead what it means to God. Not our way, but His way. What we think doesn't matter. And the reality is this, what you think doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what God thinks. We told you that this teaching was going to be tough, and that you might be tempted to find a reason to walk away. However, we would simply like to encourage you to test your faith, to really test it, and focus on building a closer relationship with the one who loves you more than anything, the one who created you and saved us from ourselves and our sin. In His love, He gives us grace, and our love back, He simply asks for obedience. 1 John chapter 5. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. If you are beginning to wonder if you might have to challenge your views on Christmas and Easter because God wants us to worship Him in truth, and because He says He does not like to be worshipped like the sun gods were worshipped, have some peace in all of this. His commandments are not burdensome. His law, His commandments, His instructions, what He wants for us, that is freedom, true freedom from the world's ways and freedom in His ways. Psalm 119. So I shall keep thy law continually forever and ever, and I will walk at liberty, for I seek thy precepts. You may be feeling like your whole world might be about ready to fall apart. But though it seems painful, please consider, it is a good thing. We have been there. There is freedom in truth. John chapter 8. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So we need to compare Christmas and Easter to ancient sun god traditions, and we need to determine if worshiping God through Christmas and Easter is worshiping in what is truth or what is false. Now that we know what we need to do, here is what the remainder of the teaching will look like. Number one, we will first examine the modern scholarly position on the roots of Christmas and Easter. Number two, we will then proceed to explore the modern defense and rationale for observing Christmas and Easter and see if it holds up to the Word. Number three, we will then find that we need to answer the question, how did this all happen? To answer that, we will go back in time, all the way back to the time of Nimrod and the Babylonians. We will then progress through history. The Chaldeans worshiped the sun god. So did the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Grecians, the Romans. They were all sun worshippers. We will discover how, when, and why such ways crept into the Christian faith. Number four, then we will actually examine some of the traditions of Christmas and Easter. We will ask the questions that perhaps many of us have never really asked. Why do we dye eggs on Easter? Where did the name Easter come from? What is with the rabbit? And what about Santa Claus? What is with the Christmas tree and the wreath? Why presents? We show where all these ancient traditions came from and then became a part of many of our lives, and all in the name of worshiping our Creator. And finally, number five, we will discuss the holidays that God actually gave us holidays that many have forgotten about, days designed to take our relationship with Him to an all-new level of joy and worship, days that were given by our Father to be all about our Messiah. So let's begin to examine some of the things on Christmas and Easter. It is so funny how times change. Believe it or not, at one time in the early U.S. settlements, Christmas was illegal. Christmas was banned in America, not by any representative of the American Civil Liberties Union, but by Christians themselves. Sounds shocking, doesn't it? Imagine trying to ban Christmas today. Macy's and Walmart sure would not tolerate that. Neither would most Christians. Christmas was once banned in Boston. The Puritans forbade the celebration of Christmas because it was a pagan feast. Episcopalians were the first in Boston to observe the holiday. They were followed by increasing numbers of young people who raised 18th century eyebrows with frolics, a reveling feast, and ball. But it wasn't until 1856 that the legislature, recognizing a losing battle when it saw it, gave in and made Christmas a legal holiday. The Phoenix Gazette, December 22nd, 1967. Isn't that interesting? Were the early U.S. Christians right, or were they simply misinformed and misled? And then we just went the right direction since then. Many are aware who Charles Spurgeon was. Many realize his influence he had over the Christian faith, shaping and presenting doctrine like few others in history. We are not saying that we agree with everything Spurgeon preached. We are simply noting a man who has had a profound Christian doctrine influence across a broad spectrum of topics. Yet, when it comes to his position on Christmas, it is often selectively unheard. Most do not realize what he preached as it relates to Christmas. We have no superstitious regard for times and seasons. Certainly we do not believe in the present ecclesiastical arrangement called Christmas. First, because we do not believe in the Mass at all, but abhor it, whether it be said or sung in Latin or in English. And secondly, because we find no scriptural warrant whatever for observing any day as the birthday of the Savior, and consequently, its observance is a superstition, because not of divine authority. Charles Spurgeon's sermon on December 24, 1871. When it can be proved that the observance of Christmas, Whitsuntide, and other popish festivals was ever instituted by a divine statute, we also will attend to them, but not till then. It is as much to our duty to reject the traditions of men as to observe the ordinances of the Lord. We ask concerning every rite and rubric, is this a law of the God of Jacob? And if it be not clearly so, it is of no authority with us, who walk in Christian liberty. Charles Spurgeon's Treasury of David on Psalm 81, verse 4. Clearly, times have changed. Most pastors would not dare to say the things Spurgeon taught on Christmas. They would lose their whole congregation. Was that a reason not to speak truth? The whole world seems to be all about Christmas and Easter. Many who celebrate these days are not even part of the Christian faith. So what gives? Since when is the world all about godly things? Since when is the world all about biblical things? Why does the world get so excited about Christmas and Easter? Spurgeon went back as far as the Roman Catholic Church and declared that institution as the vehicle that was used to inject the pagan sun god ways and customs into the body of the Messiah. And now we know why the world is so interested in those days. Because the world is not interested in the things of God. That, of course, does not speak too well about Christmas and Easter. The world actually loves those days. The world hates things of God, yet loves Christmas and Easter. Have you ever considered that? Do the math, right? The question is why. As we mentioned earlier, later in the teaching we will review all the history that details how, when, and why this all happened. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. How do we even know that Christmas and Easter derive from sun god worship and traditions? How do modern scholars view the origins of Christmas and Easter? This is where it all starts to become rather interesting. Though there are hundreds of sources and valid resources to choose from, because of time constraints, the following will be a couple of dozen quotes from encyclopedias and even Christian scholars on the nature of Christmas and Easter. These will all be things that can be validated if one is interested in testing it themselves. What we will find is that Christmas and Easter are the most certainly rooted in what is false and cultic pagan sun god traditions, not rooted in truth like he says he desires in our worship of him. What we will find is not only does secular academic work prove these things without a shadow of a doubt, that even the most prominent and educated Christian scholars basically plead no contest and have no defense against the origins and nature of Christmas and Easter. Let's read, starting with one of the most dominant Christian resource authorities, Zondervan. Gradually, a number of prevailing practices of the nations into which Christianity came were assimilated and were combined with the religious ceremonies surrounding Christmas. The assimilation of such practices generally represented efforts by Christians to transform or absorb otherwise pagan practices. The Feast of Saturnalia in early Rome, for example, was celebrated for 7 days from the 17th to the 24th of December, and was marked by a spirit of merriment, gift-giving to children, and other forms of entertainment. Gradually, early Christians replaced the pagan feast with the celebration of Christmas, but many of the traditions of this observance were assimilated and remain to this day a part of the observance of Christmas. Other nations, the Scandinavians, Germans, French, English, and others have left their mark as well. The Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible. Perhaps this verse now comes to mind, Jeremiah 10. Thus says Yahweh, do not learn the way of the nations. Concerning these ancient elements, the Christian Encyclopedia says, various symbolic elements of the pagan celebration, such as the lighting of candles, evergreen decorations, and the giving of gifts, were adapted to Christian signification. Later, as Christianity spread into Northern Europe, the Celtic, Teutonic, and Slavic winter festivals contributed holly, mistletoe, the Christmas tree, bonfires, and similar items. The Christian Encyclopedia. The giving of presents was a Roman custom, while the Yule tree and Yule log are remnants of old Teutonic nature worship. Gradually, the festival sank into mere revelry. The custom was forbidden by an act of Parliament in 1555, and the Reformation brought in a refinement in the celebration of Christmas by emphasizing its Christian elements. Unger's Bible Dictionary. So basically, Christmas was illegal because of the sun god elements until we Christianized the sun god worshiping traditions. The observance of December 25th as a Christian festival only dates from the 4th century and is due to the assimilation with the Mithric festival of the birth of the sun. World Popular Encyclopedia, Volume 3. So now you know why the date December 25th was chosen. Not because our Messiah was born on that date, but because the sun god Mithra was born on that date. There is substantial evidence that Yeshua is not born in December, but born in the fall, likely on the Feast of Sukkot. Eventually, we realized that the early Roman Catholic Church could not discontinue the pagan sun god practices. So they adopted the practice themselves, completely giving into the, if you can't beat them, then join them approach. Let's continue. The transition from festivals commemorating the birth of a sun god to the celebration ostensibly for the Son of God occurred sometime in the 4th century. Unable to eradicate the heathen celebration of Saturnalia, the Church of Rome, sometime before 336 AD, designated a feast of the Nativity to be observed. James Taylor, Christmas in the New International Dictionary of the Christian Church. Christian scholars are clear that they understand how the sun god practices and days became part of the Christian faith. They don't deny it. Many of the customs associated with Christmas also took their origins from the heathen observances. The exchanging of gifts, extravagant merriment, and the lighting of candles all had previous counterparts in the Roman Saturnalia. The use of trees harkens back to the pagan Scandinavian festival of the Yule. James Taylor, Christmas, in the New International Dictionary of the Christian Church. On the Roman New Year, houses were decorated with greenery and lights, and gifts were given to the children and the poor. To these observances were added the German and Celtic Yule rites, food and good fellowship, the Yule log and the Yule cakes, greenery, fir trees, gifts, and greetings all commemorated different aspects of this festive season. Fires and lights, symbols of warmth and lasting life, have always been associated with the winter festival, both pagan and Christian. Encyclopedia Britannica. December 25th, the birthday of Mithra, the Iranian god of light, and the day devoted to the invincible sun, as well as the day after Saturnalia, was adopted by the Roman Catholic Church as Christmas, the Nativity of Christ, to counteract the effects of these festivals. The New Encyclopedia Britannica. Christmas, it was, according to many authorities, not celebrated in the first centuries of the Christian Church, as the Christian usage in general was to celebrate the death of remarkable persons, example, Passover, death of Christ, rather than their birth. A feast was established in memory of this event, the assigned birth of Jesus, in the 4th century, In the 5th century, the Western Church ordered it to be celebrated forever on the day of the old Roman feast of the birth of the sun, as no certain knowledge of the day of Christ's birth existed. Encyclopedia Americana. The idea of using evergreens at Christmas also came to England from pre-Christian Northern European beliefs. Celtic and Teutonic tribes honored these plants at their winter solstice festivals as symbolic of eternal life, and the Druids ascribed magical properties to the mistletoe in particular. The Encyclopedia Americana International Edition. The Roman festival of the winter solstice was celebrated on the 25th of December. The Celtic and Germanic tribes held this season in veneration from the earliest times, and the Norsemen believed that their deities were present and active on earth from December 25th to January 6th. Everyman's Encyclopedia. Christianity thus replaced a pagan holiday with a Christian one, while keeping the same symbolism. The birthday of Christ corresponds to the birth of a new year. Many of the pagan customs became part of the Christmas celebrations. New Standard Encyclopedia. Pagan celebrations on December 25th had included feasting, dancing, lighting, bonfires, decorating homes with greens, and giving gifts. So when this became a Christian festival, the customs continued, but with a Christian meaning imparted to them. Encyclopedia International. Again, sun god days and ways, with a Christian stamp supposedly changing them into something good. The use of evergreens was so closely associated with the garlands of pagan days that in many of the early church celebrations they were forbidden. Alfred Karl Hotz, 1001 Christmas Facts and Fancies. Equally old was the practice of the Druids, the caste of priests among the Celts of ancient France, Britain, and Ireland, to decorate their temples with mistletoe, the fruit of the oak tree which they considered sacred. Among the German tribes, the oak tree was sacred to Odin, their god of war, and they sacrificed to it until Saint Boniface in the 8th century persuaded them to exchange it for the Christmas tree, a young fir tree adorned in honor of the Christ child. It was the German immigrants who took the custom to America. The Christian Calendar, 1974. And now, on to Easter. The term Easter is not of Christian origin. It is another form of Astarte, one of the titles of the Chaldean goddess, Queen of Heaven. The festival Pesach was a continuation of the Jewish, that is, God's feast. From this Pesach, the pagan festival of Easter was quite distinct and was introduced in the apostate Western religion as part of the attempt to adapt pagan festivals to Christianity. Vine's Complete Expository Dictionary of Old and New Testament Words. We should find this all slightly disturbing. That means that when we say we are celebrating Easter, that is the same thing as saying we are celebrating the bare-breasted fertility goddess. Clearly, we do not want to do that. That is why some churches just call it Resurrection Sunday. However, if we wanted to get really biblical, the Bible calls it first fruits and tells us exactly on what day it is on. More on that later. Let's continue. Ishtar, or Easter mythology, the chief Babylonian and Assyrian goddess associated with love, fertility, and war, being the counterpart to the Phoenician Astarte, the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. Tammuz, an ancient nature deity worshipped in Babylonia, a god of agriculture and flocks. He personified the creative powers of spring. He was loved by the fertility goddess Ishtar, who, according to one legend, was so grief-stricken at his death she contrived to enter the underworld to get him back. According to another legend, she killed him and later restored him to life. These legends and this festival, commemorating the yearly death and rebirth of vegetation, corresponding to the festivals of the Phoenician and Greek Adonis and of the Frisian Attis. The Sumerian name of Tammuz was Dumuzi. In the Bible, his disappearance is mourned by the women of Jerusalem. The Columbia Encyclopedia. The term Easter was derived from the Anglo-Saxon Estre, the name of the goddess of spring. In her honor, sacrifices were offered at the time of the vernal equinox. By the 8th century, the term came to be applied to the anniversary of Christ's resurrection. International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. The English word Easter is derived from the names Ostre, Estre, Astarte, or Astaroth. Astarte was introduced into the British Isles by the Druids and is just another name for Beltis or Ishtar of the Chaldeans and Babylonians. The book of Judges records that the children of Israel did evil in the sight of Yahweh and served Baalim and Ashtaroth and forsook Yahweh and served not him. Easter is just another name for Ashtaroth, the queen of heaven. Easter was not considered a Christian festival until the 4th century. Early Christians celebrated Passover on the 14th day of the first month, and a study on the dates on which Easter is celebrated will reveal that the celebration of Easter is not observed in accordance with the prescribed time for the observance of Passover. After much debate, the Nicene Council of 325 AD decreed that Easter should be celebrated on the first Sunday at the vernal equinox. Why was so much debate necessary if Easter was a tradition passed down from the apostles? The answer is that it was not an apostolic institution, but an invention of man. They had to make up some rules. History records that spring festivals in honor of the pagan fertility goddesses and the events associated with them were celebrated at the same time as Easter. In the year 399 AD, the Theodosian Code attempted to remove the pagan connotation from those events and banned their observance. The pagan festival of Easter originated as the worship of the sun goddess, the Babylonian queen of heaven, who was later worshipped under many names, including Ishtar, Cybele, Adia Matar, the Great Mother, or Astarte, for whom the celebration of Easter is named. Easter is not another name for the Feast of Passover, and is not celebrated at the biblically prescribed time for Passover. This pagan festival was supposedly Christianized several hundred years after Christ, too long in the sun. The egg as a symbol of fertility and renewed life goes back to the ancient Egyptians and Persians, who had also the custom of coloring and eating eggs during their spring festival. Encyclopedia Britannica. The exchange of Easter eggs, which symbolize new life and fertility, is one of the oldest traditions. Rabbits and flowers are also pagan fertility symbols. New Standard Encyclopedia. The hare, the symbol of fertility in ancient Egypt, a symbol that was kept later in Europe, is not found in North America. Its place is taken by the Easter rabbit, the symbol of fertility and periodicity, both human and lunar, accredited with laying eggs in nests prepared for it at Easter, or with hiding them away for children to find. The New Encyclopedia Britannica. The custom of a sunrise service on Easter Sunday can be traced to ancient spring festivals that celebrated the rising sun. The New Book of Knowledge. That might bring to mind the following verse from Scripture. Ezekiel chapter 8. Then he said to me, Have you seen this, O son of man? You will see still greater abominations than these. And he brought me into the inner court of the house of Yahweh, and behold, at the entrance of the temple of Yahweh, between the porch and the altar, there were about 25 men, with their backs to the temple of Yahweh, and their faces toward the east, worshiping the sun toward the east. We could have spent hours presenting more academic and Christian scholar research on this subject, but we're sure you get the point. Ask yourself, does Christmas and Easter still feel right to you? Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 30. Take heed to yourself that you are not snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, How did these nations serve their gods? We will do the same. You must not worship Yahweh, your God, in their way. Jeremiah 10, Thus says Yahweh, do not learn the way of the nations. Deuteronomy chapter 12, You must not worship Yahweh, your God, in their way. Is Christmas and Easter rooted in cultic pagan sun god worship and traditions? Clearly, the answer is a disappointing yes. And what about John chapter 4? But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Is Christmas and Easter rooted in what is truth or rooted in what is false? Clearly, they are both rooted in what is false. This means that anyone teaching from the pulpit likely knows all of this. There is not many that even attempt to suggest that Christmas and Easter are derived from godly origins. Nearly everyone who has entertained an ounce of study on these matters knows that Christmas and Easter are purely the result of sun god ways and traditions. The only thing that changed was the name of who was being worshipped and the supposed symbolic meaning behind the traditions. Meaning this, the sun god days and traditions of what became Christmas and Easter were clearly changed in the sense of what they mean to us. But does that mean that we can change what it all means to God? Is it alarming to realize that Yahweh, who says he does not change, said he hates being worshipped with sun god traditions, yet that is exactly the nature of Christmas and Easter? That leads us to the second part of this teaching. How is it that all of this is so well known, but Christmas and Easter still continue amongst those in the faith? Yeshua even had words for those who continue to promote and practice such tradition despite what is written in the Word. Mark chapter 7. And he said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition." Verse 13. "Thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many such things you do." How is all this rationalized? Why is this all not a big deal? The answer lies within the same deceit that the adversary has presented to God's people from the beginning. God really didn't mean that you would die if you would eat the fruit. Meaning this, God doesn't really mean that he doesn't like being worshipped like pagan sun god ways and traditions. Or perhaps, God really didn't mean that he only wants to be worshipped in spirit and truth. He's okay with what is false. Supposedly, these things no longer matter to God. So then, of course, it shouldn't matter to us either. Let's consider some dominant examples of this way of thinking. If one searches Google on whether Christians should keep Christmas, the first article that pops up is one from Bible.org. Keep in mind, Bible.org is one of the top dominant websites on the whole planet for the Christian faith. In this article from Bible.org, Should Christians Celebrate Christmas?, the author spends several paragraphs agreeing that Christmas came from pagan cultic sun god ways, days, and traditions. Then, after all of that, here is his quote. "The pagan associations were lost long ago." Long ago? As if since we forgot where those days came from and those ways came from, then God did as well? Do we really think that God forgot? Do we really think he no longer cares? Did he violate his word and change? The author then concludes that section of man-made opinion and speculative reasoning, ignores God's thoughts on the matter, and makes this, hate to say it, but rather arrogant statement. We can make something evil out of it or something good. That is literally saying that we can take what is evil in the mind of God, turn it around like we are some magical Christian fairies, and poof, make it good. That we ourselves, as man, not God, somehow have the choice to define it as evil or good. How in the world can we make good out of what God defined as evil? Right now your brain should be screaming the following verse, Isaiah chapter 5. "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." That type of thinking and doctrine should scare the living daylights out of most faith-based people. Yet, this is the only defense that theologians and scholars have for keeping Christmas and Easter, that we can change something evil into something good. Nearly every popular Christian defense of Christmas and Easter uses similar statements. Why? Because there is no other defense. They already admit that their traditions are a pagan, cultic, sun god origin. What else can they say? It's all they can say. You will find nearly the exact same argument from equip.org, gotquestions.org, Grace to You Ministries, and many other popular Christian resources and ministries. The only defense they have is to pretend that God is suddenly okay with sun god days and traditions, and that we have the power to turn what is evil in the sight of God into something good. Can we now make something unholy now holy? Can we make the profane pleasing in the sight of our Creator? Even though God is a God who does not change, can we change what he hates into something he likes just because we put his name on it and say it is for him and his son? Think about it. Come on, let us reason together. How would that go over with your spouse? Suppose you gave a gift to your spouse, but that gift is something your spouse detests. What would you say as you smile and give it to her? Would you say that you should like it anyway, because it is what is in my heart that counts? That I put your name on the box, so you should like it and be happy? God forbid we do something like that to our spouse, and may we never do that to our Creator. Such an approach is literally making ourselves out to be God instead by saying we will do it our way instead of God's way. It is saying we will give what we want to give, not what He desires from us. This way of thinking is nothing new. It is literally the way of Cain. In the account of Cain, Cain decided to do things his own way, what was right in his own mind, or he followed what was right in his own heart, if you will. 1 John chapter 3. We should not be like Cain, who was the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. You might be thinking, surely defending Christmas and Easter cannot be just like Cain. How is that the same at all? Well, let's find out. According to John, Cain murdered his own brother because Cain's ways were evil and his brothers were righteous. Before we begin discussing Cain, we need to mention something rather important that not all realize. When the Bible uses Lord in all capital letters, it is actually the translators replacing the Creator's name as a tetragrammaton in Hebrew, Yod-He, Vav-He. We often place that back into the Scriptures as He intended, and based on our best scholarly guess and many others, we pronounce that as Yahweh. Genesis chapter 4. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of Yahweh. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to Yahweh an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought his firstborn of his flock, and of their fat portions. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. And Cain was very angry, and his face fell. Yahweh said to Cain, Why are you angry? And why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain most certainly knew the law of God, or the Torah in Hebrew, meaning instructions. It demanded at an appointed time, or moed in Hebrew, God instructed a certain sacrifice. Sometimes the law of God demands a grain offering, sometimes a sacrifice. In this instance, God required a sacrifice, like Abel offered. Cain decided to do and offer what he wanted to offer. Abel heard and obeyed the Father. Cain decided to do what he thought was right, or what he thought was best, to worship in his own way, to follow his own heart. Thus, the Cain attitude is to do things our own way, despite what Yahweh wants or desires. Jude chapter 11. Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain, and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. It is easy to get caught up in the trap of thinking we can worship God in any way we choose. God's people have been known to make that mistake over and over again. The most classic example is the way of Cain mentality is in the event of the golden calf. Yeah, believe it or not, Christmas and Easter can be compared to the event of the golden calf. How many realize that the intent of the Israelites was not to worship a false god with the golden calf, but Yahweh our God? In the story of the golden calf, once again, God's people start doing things and worshiping God their own way. God does not appreciate His people worshiping Him in any way that they choose. There is a protocol that He has defined for us, a way to worship Him, and the way is not to worship Him. He is the one being worshipped, not us. We need to understand how we are to worship Him and not worship Him. We should not want to mess that up. But that is what God's people do all too often. And the story of the golden calf is no different. It's the most classic example of us trying to worship God in our own way, not His way. It all starts in Exodus 32. Here we find that Moses has gone up to the mountain, but after some time, the Israelites begin to panic, for they fear that Moses has died. Exodus chapter 32. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Moses was much more than simply a leader to them. Moses was their only mediator between God and man. Moses spoke to God on their behalf, and God spoke to the Israelites through Moses. Moses was the mediator between God and man. This head role is now reserved for Yeshua and Yeshua alone. and only Yeshua now functions as Moses. However, during the time of the Exodus, Moses was the mediator. Here's their perceived problem. They feared that they lost Moses. They believed that they needed to replace their mediator. They were afraid they're not going to be able to communicate with Yahweh any longer because their mediator, Moses, is missing, or perhaps even dead. Since they were in Egypt, they happened to learn a thing or two about the Egyptian tradition of interacting with gods. In their understanding, you require a physical medium to facilitate such divine interaction. They needed a mediator between them and God. We know that this is what they were thinking because they instructed to Aaron, "Make us gods who shall go before us." And then what do we see as their reason for saying this? "As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So in their mind, Yahweh, through Moses, brought them out of Egypt, yet Moses is now missing. And in their mind, that's a big problem, and big problems require urgent solutions. So the urgent solution was to make us gods. But how would gods replace Moses? And how would gods be a good thing in their mind? Have they already forgotten who brought them out of Egypt? And have they forgotten who just spoke to them down at the mountain before they became afraid and asked Moses to go up and get the commandments for them? In the English, this certainly sounds bad. However, the word here for gods in Hebrew is Elohim. Elohim is the Hebrew word also translated as the one true God, or it could also be translated as gods. So nearly any time you see the word God in your English translations, the Hebrew word is in fact Elohim, despite the fact that Elohim is plural. Elohim can refer to false gods or the one true God. The context determines the correct understanding. So, we need to figure out if the Israelites were attempting to make a physical image of God as a mediator to reach God, or were they trying to make gods as in false gods? The Israelites, as a solution to replace the perhaps dead Moses, to replace their mediator with God, decided that they need to make God, or really create that interface they believed they needed to have so they can talk with God, to replace Moses, who they feared was dead. So often we have been taught that the Israelites were making a false God, but in the English it says that they wanted to make gods, not God. Clearly, they only made one God, despite the fact that they used a plural form of El, which is Elohim. That suggests that they meant that they wanted to make the one true God, Elohim, not false gods. Otherwise, they would have made multiple gods, just like the English translation suggests. Now, that may not be enough to prove the point for you, but there is much more to consider. Most already know that the Israelites chose to make a calf. In fact, they seemingly entertained no debate or discussion about it. It simply seemed to be the understood form that Yahweh should take. But why did they choose a calf? Exodus 32, verses 2 through 4. So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took all the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. If the Israelites were trying to make Yahweh in physical form, as a mediator to replace Moses, it was certainly no accident that the Israelites chose a calf. Why? Why did they choose a calf to represent Yahweh? In Scripture, God is often likened to an ox, even in the context of the Exodus. For example, Numbers chapter 24. God brings them out of Egypt. He has the strength like a wild ox. Why, though, and how would they have known this? They knew this because they spoke and wrote ancient pictograph Hebrew. Do you recall the English word translated as God in English Bibles? It's the Hebrew word Elohim. There are two Hebrew words commonly translated as God, El and Eloah. When reading the Bible, it is better to have an ancient Hebrew perception of God rather than our modern Western view. The word El was originally written with two pictographic letters, one being an ox head and the other a shepherd's staff. The ox represented strength, and the staff of the shepherd represented authority. First, the ancient Hebrews saw God as the strong one of authority. The shepherd's staff was also understood as a staff on the shoulders, a yoke. Secondly, the ancient Hebrews saw God as the ox in the yoke. When plowing a field, two oxen were placed in a yoke. One was older and more experienced, and the other younger and lesser experienced. The younger would learn from the older. The Hebrews saw God as the older experienced ox, and they as the younger who learns from him. The plural form of Eloah is Elohim, and is often translated as God. While English plurals only identify quantity, as in more than one, the Hebrew plural can identify quantity as well as quality. Something that is of great size or stature can be written in the plural form, and in this case, God, as great strength and authority, is frequently written in the plural form Elohim. The two letters in these Hebrew words are the ox head representing strength and the shepherd staff representing authority. Combined, they mean the strong authority, as well as the ox with a staff. The yoke is understood as a staff on the shoulders. If you are interested, you can learn more at the Ancient Hebrew Research Center. So, the choosing of a calf to represent God was clearly intentional. There is a logical reason that they did not choose a rabbit or a fish or anything else. Elohim in the Hebrew gives us the word picture of the ox and authority. And guess what? They said they're going to make Elohim. Make us Elohim who shall go before us. Remember, Elohim is the same Hebrew word that is translated as God in Scripture. And Elohim as a word picture fits their interest in making a calf perfectly. Thus, they were not interested in making gods, so to speak. They were interested in making God, or Yahweh. Not so much as they literally thought that they were making God, but they were continuing in the Egyptian tradition and practice of making an image of God so you can connect and speak to him. Which, of course, is what Moses was for, but they feared that he was dead. After the golden calf is presented, Israel says something very interesting. Exodus chapter 32, verse 4. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. In the English, it seems that they're presenting the golden calf as gods. But that doesn't make any sense. It's singular. In reality, he is saying to Israel, here's your Elohim, or if you will, here's your God who brought you out of Egypt, meaning the one true God. Now, clearly, in most English translations, the usage of gods does not make any sense for multiple reasons. Israel already declared Yahweh to be their only God. Why would Israel suddenly believe that a different God took them out of Egypt? That would make no sense whatsoever. In addition, only one God took them out of Egypt, and the Israelites knew this. So why do English translators use the plural form gods, as in false gods, when that would make no sense? Aaron is only presenting one golden calf, not golden calves, meaning singular, not plural. Meaning this, and this is important to understand. The Israelites clearly never intended on making gods, but instead God, as evidenced by the one singular God they made in the form of a calf, which happens to be the exact same word picture that the pictograph of Elohim represents in Hebrew. And then they say that this golden calf brought them out of Egypt. Clearly they know this is not literally the case, as Yahweh brought them out of Egypt. So why do English translations say gods and not God? Because of the nature of the Hebrew word Elohim. Elohim can mean the plural form of false gods or the one true God. This would mean that the Israelites believed that they produced an image of Yahweh as the calf. They believed that they created an image of the one true God who took them out of Egypt. This should make much more sense because the ancient Hebrew pictograph of Elohim is an ox with an authority. So they are simply creating what they already understood about God. In an effort to relieve their concerns about losing Moses as their mediator, they in fact created an image of their understanding of Yahweh to worship and connect with him as their new mediator. They were so worried that they lost Moses, which was their mediator to connect with Yahweh, that they believed they had to replace Moses with an object to be the new mediator between Israel and God. So all of these things clearly tell us that they were intending to worship Yahweh through the calf. Still don't believe it despite all the evidence? Do you still believe that the Israelites were trying to worship false gods instead of worshiping Yahweh in their own way? There's still one more thing that solidifies this understanding, and this is huge. In the Hebrew, we are told that Aaron actually dedicates a feast to Yahweh. Exodus 32, verses 5 through 6. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, Tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh. And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Aaron declares that the feast is for Yahweh, and then they offer gifts to him. Unfortunately, this is the way of Cain mentality to the extreme. You might be thinking, in my Bible, it says Lord, not Yahweh. But recall what we mentioned earlier. Anytime that we see Lord in capital letters in English Bibles, we know that it is intentionally replacing the tetragrammaton Yod-He-Vav-He, or as we often pronounce it, Yahweh. Anyone can look into any Hebrew concordance and see for themselves that Aaron literally dedicated the feast to Yahweh, the God that took them out of Egypt. This proves without a doubt that the Israelites were simply trying to replace Moses and connect to Yahweh in a different way. The Israelites were not trying to make God, so to speak, but God, Elohim. They chose a calf for Yahweh because he is Elohim. This is what is important to understand, because this is what they did. They chose to invent their own feast, their own holiday, to Yahweh instead of the feast outlined in Leviticus 23. They chose to worship God their own way instead of God's way. They sincerely thought that they were doing the right thing. They thought it was okay to make up their own holiday for Yahweh and worship him how they chose. But clearly, despite the fact that the Israelites were sincerely attempting to worship God, even dedicating the day to him, giving gifts to him, God did not see it that way. They were worshiping God through the pagan practice of using things to worship God and declaring and putting into effect a false holiday. They even made offerings to Yahweh. They really thought that Yahweh would accept their worship, just like Cain did, the way of Cain. And here's the main issue of the problem at hand. Because the Israelites decided to do things their own way instead of God's way, they made themselves out to be their own gods. Though they fully and sincerely wanted to follow Yahweh, they followed themselves and their own heart instead. This is exactly what we do with Christmas and Easter. We take the ways of man, ways of false gods, and then offer them all up to God and expect him to smile while we please ourselves in the process. Now we realize that might sound harsh, and many will not want to hear that. But no, it is the truth. When we do these things our way instead of his way, then who in our mind is God at that point? Do you see the problem from God's perspective? We can still be claiming to be worshiping the one true God, but if we abandon his way and do it our own way, we are actually worshiping false gods in the process. Sadly, we are worshiping ourselves, bowing down to ourselves and following ourselves. We're following our own instructions instead of his. How does he want us to worship him? John chapter 4. But the hour is coming, and now is here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. How does he not want us to worship him? Deuteronomy 12:4. You must not worship Yahweh your God in their way. What way should we not learn? Learn not the ways of the nations. Jeremiah chapter 10. We fully realize that much of what we covered was shocking in the least. In reality, so far, this was mostly just an introduction to the topic. At this point, a couple of things should be clear. Yahweh said we cannot worship him in the ways that pagans worship their sun gods. That fully eliminates Christmas and Easter altogether in that alone. In addition, clearly, Christmas and Easter are not rooted in truth. They come from false ways of worshiping false gods. These are the ways of the nations, ways he has told us not to learn. It might be surprising to many, but God is not on the same page of the let's keep Christ in Christmas bandwagon. God does not appreciate the Cain mentality, the mentality that says it's okay in one's heart to worship God in the way we choose, contrary to the way that he requests. We must learn from the mistakes of Israel, who, doing what was right in their own mind, chose to worship God in their own way, offering him a new holiday, a new festival with gifts and worship up to him. Cain was also sincere. Israelites with the golden calf were sincere. Our intent in celebrating Christmas and Easter may be very sincere as well. But the problem is this: according to God, not according to us, not according to anyone else, despite all the theologians promising you it's simply okay, God himself said, no, it is not okay. It is not how I want to be worshipped. He loved us so much that he sent his own son that we might live. That being said, let's live for him in his ways, not our way. Let's love him back in the way that he has told us he wants to be loved. We hope that this has given you much already to consider. However, there is simply so much more. The question still remains, how did all these pagan cultic sun god traditions become married to the Christian faith? Where did all this come from? How did it get here? And what do all these traditions originally mean? You'll be shocked to learn that many of these pagan sun god traditions and their original symbolism and where they came from. In the next part of this teaching, we will cover all these things and much more. You'll find that it starts to become even more interesting. We hope that this teaching has blessed you. And remember, continue to test everything. Shalom.